that. Their sign reads, "The Syrian people are being slaughtered, O Arabs." So many Syrians, like people everywhere, hold multiple allegiances, celebrate diverse traditions, are frequently of mixed backgrounds, may not fit cleanly and neatly into the rubrics of religious identity, into the religious identitarianism, if you want to call it that, demanded by religious freedom advocates. Left out in the cold, these people, these kind of in-betweens, find themselves in an impossible and vexed position of having to make political claims on religious grounds, I'm this or I'm that, or simply having no grounds from which to speak. Dissenters, doubters, families that may have multiple religious affiliations under the same roof become pressured, may even feel compelled to choose a side. This is the logic of sectarianism. They are required to respond to an imperative to define their identity in religious terms. Are you this or are you that? Tell me, what are you? This is what I mean when I say that religious freedom has the potential to activate, to energize, and indeed to politicize religious difference. I'm not saying it always does, and I'm going to go into some more detail here. But I am suggesting that in this framing of this conflict, I'm getting interference. Is there volume on here? No. All right, maybe that did it. In this framing, then, religious freedom promotion paradoxically may add fuel to the fire of the very sectarian conflict that religious freedom claims to be uniquely equipped to transcend. A bizarre paradox. So to suggest that this conflict stems from a failure to acknowledge the rights of certain believers conceals the ways in which social divisions cut across sectarian divides in Syria. There's great work on this, actually. It obscures the ways forward when the focus is not on beliefs or communities of believers, but rather on shared human needs, on human dignity, on visions, on accountability, transparency, and fair governance, the real issues in this conflict. To be clear, now let me just explain. The mobilization of the logic of sectarianism for political ends extends far beyond Syria. It extends far beyond the language of religious freedom. For example, this logic has come to dominate media coverage of the uprising in Bahrain that is ongoing right now. Here in Bahrain, an embattled regime, challenged by both Shia and Sunni dissenters, has largely succeeded in framing the conflict as sectarian, mobilizing Sunni against Shia on the claim that the Shia are controlled by a predatory Iran, as Joost Hilterman has argued in the New York Review of Books. Hilterman says, by whipping up sectarian sentiments, the Bahraini government hopes to change the perception of the conflict from one that pits a popular pro-democracy movement against an authoritarian regime, just like Syria, to one of a sectarian struggle between Sunni and Shia, with the strong government needed to step in and maintain order. What I am suggesting is that religious freedom taps into and feeds into this logic, but it does not generate it by itself. It's a complex field. It feeds into a broader complex. So what I am suggesting is that in Syria, in Bahrain, and elsewhere, the complex histories, the experiences, and the uncertainties that shape religious identification in the contemporary world simply cannot be squeezed into the rigid categories imposed by top-down religious freedom promotion. They just don't fit. They don't do justice to people's lives, to their lived experiences, to their lived religion, and non-religion, for that matter. Recent scholarship in the study of religion is helpful in helping me to develop this point. As Noah Solomon and Jeremy Welton argued very recently in a book, the Cambridge book edited by Bob Orsi, my colleague at Northwestern, what makes someone a believer or a member of a faith community, and what makes someone not so? What life experiences, confessional commitments, and ritual practices qualify one as an insider and which prohibit someone from inclusion? Are insider and outsider categories that we must inhabit permanently, or can we move between them? Most importantly, should scholars or governments or international organizations attempt to adjudicate these questions of religious identity and belonging, thereby becoming arbiters of orthodoxy? So in this passage, Solomon and Walton are alluding to the complexities of religious affiliation and practice. This This is old news for all of these great religious studies scholars I know sitting here in front of me. They acknowledge the difficulties of assigning individuals to the category of believer or non-believer, the movement, the flux, the parts that don't fit. They allude to the structures of power, what they call the arbiters of orthodoxy, that are implicated in deciding who's in, who's not in at any given moment. By and large, I'm saying that contemporary international religious freedom advocacy by states and other large, powerful authorities works in the opposite direction. Rather than, as Solomon and Walton do, questioning the power of established authorities to make these designations, rather than interrogating the ability or the willingness of individuals to live by them, these projects strengthen lines of difference, funnel people into one community or another, authorize and politicize boundaries that might not otherwise have as much political traction. To borrow a phrase from a new book by Hussein Agrama, religious freedom turns religion into an object of politics. Is this a world we want to live in? Is there an alternative? So now I'm going to talk, the last section that I'm going to talk about is going to go a little bit more social theoretical, since the title of the lecture series is Critical Thinking and Social Theory, so bear with me. But we'll start out a little bit lighter. So what I've suggested is that the story of international religious freedom is kind of like a good movie. It offers something for everyone, right? It's a battle between cowardly oppressors and the undaunted and heroic saviors of the downtrodden. Who wouldn't want to see that movie? It's a story of the triumph of international law and the policing of those who fail to adhere to global norms and standards. A more boring movie for sure, but nonetheless something that certain people in international relations would definitely line up for. It's a story of the secular tolerance of plural beliefs as a remedy for those backward religious beliefs that would otherwise generate violence. So it's a story of taming religion, an old story, a very old story. And today especially, it's also a story of the need for the US government and others, increasingly, to convince people in other countries, particularly but not only Muslims, that they should endorse a model, the model, as it turns out, of religious liberty, as a template for organizing and democratizing themselves, their polities, and their societies. So as you've probably gathered, my story is more complex and less self-congratulatory. I've suggested these initiatives draw lines that divide religion from non-religion, which is then often marked as culture, often differentiate believer from non-believer, and mark off one religious community from another. They also help to create individual subjects in what are called faith communities. We are always talking about faith communities, for whom choosing and believing in religion are seen as the defining characteristics of what it is to be a modern subject, and the right to choose to believe or not as the essence of what it means to be free. To achieve this unity then in freedom of belief, this belief in belief across these various communities of belief, is what it means to have achieved religious freedom. So, by empowering religious authorities at the expense of dissenters, doubters, and those on the margins, as my colleague Winnie Sullivan has argued, religious freedom may also undermine democracy abroad. And this is not because democracy is necessarily secular, but rather because the forms of religion, the hierarchical institutionalized forms of religion that are defended by the American bishops, the US State Department, Open Doors, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Christian Solidarity International, and now perhaps DFATE, heavily regulates, may even shut down on occasion, the very spaces in which non-established, diverse, and democratic forms of religion may actually have a chance to flourish. So if we can say that the problem, we might agree that the problem that religious freedom is designed to solve is to find ways somehow to live together across deep, multidimensional social, political, religious diversity and difference. If that is the case, I'm suggesting that this may be something that necessarily has to occur if it is to mean anything outside of those spaces that are enacted through legal regulation by large public and private authorities, whether religious or secular. You can call them what you like. Religious freedom then needs to be reimagined. We need to think differently. We need to think of it as a site of resistance against these authorities, rather than a form of discipline imposed by them that funnels people into predefined religious boxes and then politicizes their differences. We could call this an agonistic model of freedom. To move in that direction, I adapt a notion of freedom articulated by Foucault. I'm not going to cite Foucault, I'm not going to go into that in a talk, but I'm going to say, just to cite William Connolly, in this image, William Connolly explains freedom is not reducible to the freedom of subjects. It is at least partly the release of that which doesn't fit into the molds of subjectivity and normalization. So what this means is it leads us to a different conception of rights. And this is broader than just religious rights, but rights in general. So rights are attached not to the self as a subject, but to that which is defined by the normalized subject as otherness, as deviating from, as falling below, or failing to live up to the standard of subjectivity. Freedom, more broadly, then, emerges here as a site of resistance, as a constant moving mode of insurrection against attempts to institutionalize and normalize subjects. It's not a mode of discipline, whether religious or political. It's not something that's imposed by authorities on subjects who are known only by their deficits in rights. It is instead attached precisely to that which the authorities define as otherness, as unorthodox, as dissenting, as minority, as minoritarian. Social theory offers a lot of resources to elaborate this alternative. An agonistic approach to rights resonates with William James' concept of anarchical or willful individuality. In political theorist Alexander Livingston's reading of William James, freedom is located in the arc of critically negotiating norms imposed by the authorities. Wary of the rigidities imposed by large modern institutions, suspicious of a tendency to fix and stabilize difference in the name of unity, James endeavored to ease the grip of what he called monism on our thinking, to counter this pervasive tendency in modernity to attempt to reconcile all difference into one, into unity. And I think James's politics, which I won't go into more here, are helpful as we start to consider and think about religious freedom. He allows us to see that the object here is not to overcome or overturn or throw out religious freedom. No, it is to engage the presumptive dimensions of the politics that accompany these projects, each separate project that is undertaken in the name of religious freedom. What are the presumptive dimensions? For example, I've suggested that top-down religious freedom advocacy by states often attempts to define and corral religious difference. In the process of trying to manage and straighten things out and keep it neat and tidy and oversee it, it actually politicizes it. James's suspicion of large institutions and modern forms of power is echoed by Talal Assad. And Assad observes that the modern idea of religious belief, protected as an individual right, is a function of the secular state, but not of democratic sensibility. In its strongest forms, then, the promotion of international religious freedom globalizes the secular state's power over the individual. Appearing as a guarantee of the worth of the individual's own desires, as it is aptly marketed, it's actually a story of telling people who they are, how to be, and what to do. It privileges certain ways of doing, not intentionally, inadvertently, and privileges certain ways of being as deserving special protection by the state or associations thereof. It singles out authorized representatives of believers, and less frequently non-believers as well, for legal protection, reinforcing divisions and hierarchies within and between communities. In its most insistent moments, it's a story of the cost in human dignity and diversity that is associated with the attempt to make, as Don Lopez argued, belief the measure of what religion is understood to be, and the freedom to believe the measure of what it means to be free. So the kind of approach that I'm advocating, that I'm thinking through here with regard to religious freedom, is an attempt to shake up this attempt, to destabilize it. The idea is to allow new identities to come up from beneath the threshold of public recognition, such as those seeking legal and political protections that are already enjoyed by others. Here we might think of campaigns by the Baha'i citizens of Egypt for civic and political recognition. We may